Islamabad. Indonesia, however, stands out. It stands out for a number of reasons, and this is why I'm going to really focus on Indonesia today. My thesis is that for a number of completely unrelated reasons, which are contingent and accidental, ironically, what we have in Indonesia today is perhaps the only example of a truly modern scientific Islamic university. And we're talking about the 4 main Islamic universities that will be my focus today. But before we get to that, I'll just very quickly, and this will be the main gist of my presentation today, give you an account of how this process came about. Because, of course, each country is specific, and the experience of the development of Islamic higher education in Pakistan, Malaysia, Indonesia, and Bangladesh are very, very different. But let's start with the dominant religion in countries like Malaysia, Brunei, and Indonesia going back to the 19th century. And of course, what is important, and this we often forget, is that the reason why Islam is so politicized in countries like Malaysia and Indonesia is that the history of Muslim activism in both countries goes back to the 19th century. 2 factors stand out. One, in the mid-19th century onwards, as a reaction to both colonialism and the introduction of colonial capitalism, the first indigenous local groups to organize economically were actually the Islamist groups. A good example would be the Syarikat Islam, which was set up in Indonesia at the beginning of the 20th century, which in fact was the first Indonesian Muslim trade cooperative, if you like, that was put together for the sake of organizing wealth, Indonesian Muslim wealth, concentrating it to give it political mobilization. Another factor which is very important is the fact that the Indonesian Islamists, like the Malaysian Islamists, were also actively involved in the anti-colonial movement. When you look back at the 19th century, particularly from the late 19th, early 20th century, among the first intellectuals and activists to organize trade unions, workers' movements, student movements, and anti-colonial movements happened to be Muslims. And this was a very interesting period because the encounter with modernity and then encounter with colonialism happened at the same time. Much of what transpired as early nascent Muslim political activism in Southeast Asia was a reaction to both, a reaction against Western colonialism, but at the same time a reaction against the imposition of Western capital. And so from the outset, Muslim political organization in Southeast Asia has had political objectives. And one of the political objectives at the time was education. And education was a key issue that actually motivated and galvanized a lot of the Indonesian and Malaysian Islamist organizations at the late 19th and early 20th century. And so with this as the background, and when we look back at the history of both countries, we'll see that in Malaysia and Indonesia, the emergence of itself in Indonesia, there was still the problem of Muslim secessionism going on in the outer island provinces. Remember, throughout the 70s and 80s, while negotiating with Muslim scholars and students on campuses, the Suharto government was still facing revolts in places like Sumatra, Sulawesi, Moluccas, from splinter groups that were calling for the splitting up of Indonesia and the creation of an Islamic state. The Darul Islam movement was still fighting out there in the provinces. And then, of course, next door you have Malaysia, you have Pakistan, where you see Islamization becoming, gaining political momentum, leading to, of course, the Iranian Revolution of 1979. So it's against this context that you have the Suharto government very, very cautious about political Islam, very worried about the growing Islamic activism on campus, worried that it cannot control the madrasas, and still trying its best to bring the madrasa system into the national educational mainstream. So, of course, by 1983, while Malaysia next door had already created its first Islamic university, had introduced Islamic banking, had introduced Islamic insurance, had raised the level of the Islamic courts to the same level of the civil court in Indonesia, the government was still trying its best to keep the Islamists at arm's length, bring them in but control them and make sure that they remain disempowered at the same time. In 1983, a crucial conference was held at one of these Islamic research academies in Jakarta, EIAN Sharif Hidayatullah. And the conference was called Islam and Development. Now, the theme of the conference was simple. This was basically Suharto's attempt to tell the Muslims of Indonesia that this is what he meant by Islam. Modern Islam, as defined by the Suharto government then, was an Islam that was compatible with modern, urban, capital-driven development. In other words, the purpose of Islamic education, as laid out in this conference, was not to create more imams for the mosque, not to create more religious students to fill the madrasas, but to create Muslim technocrats, Muslims who could work in business, Muslims who could be scientists. And this was state engineering in a very crude way. And some would call it, Islamization, but at the point of a gun, because the combination of security concerns, the interests of the army and the nationalists, the fears of the non-Muslim minority, all played into this. And these were the factors, the internal variable factors that were shaping the Islamic educational process in Indonesia. By the time we get to the 90s, of course, Indonesia's economic boom has exploded because, Indonesia, Malaysia,